Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes before we go live on Facebook. In the meantime, feel free to introduce yourself, type your name, your affiliation, or where you're from into the chat box. And we'll start in a minute or two. So we have people from Vietnam today, from New Zealand, from the United States, Bangladesh, Philippines, Nepal, Indonesia, China, and Malaysia. So great to have a wide range of people from around the world. Okay, welcome everyone to Learn by the Nuggets. Meet our members, best practices on environmental policies in the Pacific. So again, welcome to everyone from various countries around the world, from China, from Vietnam, New Zealand, United States, Bangladesh, Philippines, Nepal, Indonesia, Malaysia, and us here in New Zealand. So my name is Liam Prince. I'm the chair of the Aotearoa Plastic Pollution Alliance, or APA. I'm based here in Te Whanganui-a-Tara, also known as Wellington, the capital city of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So this webinar is co-organized by the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, or Gaia, Asia Pacific, and the organization that I represent, the Aotearoa Plastic Pollution Alliance, or APA. So APA is an alliance of researchers, educators, scientists, activists, businesses, conservationists, artists, and many more who are all working to mitigate and prevent plastic pollution in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Oceania. We hold events and monthly meetings to discuss the impacts of plastic production, disposal, and pollution. We aim to integrate the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which is a foundational constitutional document of New Zealand, as well as integrating Mātauranga Māori or Māori knowledge and Pacifica science to promote the latest research and information about the impacts of and the solutions to plastic pollution at a local, national, and international scale. We're also a proud member of Gaia, the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, which is a global network of over 800 organizations in over 90 countries and have been working for a just, waste-free world for over 20 years. So let me just tell you a few words about Learn by the Nuggets. So Gaia Asia Pacific is holding this webinar following demands from members for a convenient Asia Pacific time to join Gaia Global webinars. This series features the work of our members. It features reports from Gaia experts and our members and discussions of Gaia Asia Pacific campaigns. Now we're recording this webinar live. It will be available on the Gaia Asia Pacific Facebook page, and participants may also post additional questions on various Facebook pages, including the organizations represented today. And the recorded session will also be uploaded to the Gaia YouTube channel, so you can watch it later. Today's webinar is part of the Meet Our Members series, and we'll be looking at best practices on environmental policies in the Pacific. This is inspired by Gaia's commitment towards zero waste in the region to share existing policies that help to curb plastic and waste issues, not just in Asia Pacific, but in the entire world. And really what we would like to happen is to inspire more development organizations, more local government agencies, impact investors and financing institutions to develop portfolios for zero waste initiatives. We're obviously very heavily represented by New Zealand-based organizations today, so our discussion will naturally look at a lot of plastic and waste issues from a New Zealand perspective, but we'll also be looking more broadly at specific plastic issues, policies, and policy lobbying across the Pacific, and particularly the South Pacific. I also want to acknowledge that neither myself nor either of our speakers today are Indigenous to New Zealand or the Pacific, but there are many brilliant and visionary Māori and Pacifica leaders and Māori-led and Pacifica-led organizations working in the zero waste and plastic pollution sector here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I just wanted to acknowledge the lack of Indigenous representation in this discussion. And while we cannot speak on behalf of Māori or Pasifika people, we do acknowledge their leadership in this space. So just a couple of points before we dive in on logistics. This nugget will last about 1.5 hours. Please use the Q&A section on the Zoom if you want to ask questions of the speakers. So not the chat box, but the Q&A section. And later we might unmute some of those in Zoom for questions, but we can't promise that we can accommodate everyone. Please remember that questions can still be posted a few minutes after the session. And you can send through an email and we'll do our best to respond to those too. If you experience technical issues in Zoom, please contact our technical support team through the chat box. And just to give you a quick view of what's going to happen in the next 1.5 hours, we'll have a quick introduction of our speakers one by one, and then we'll lead directly to questions and discussion about the work and that they and their organizations are doing, specifically in regard to zero waste, and their perspectives on a whole range of issues in their field of work. So let's begin. I'll just introduce our speakers and ask them to share with our viewers a short description about their organizations and what they're focused on. So to start with, joining me is Hannah Bloomhart of the New Zealand Product Stewardship Council, also of the Rubbish Trip, and also a member of the Aotearoa Plastic Pollution Alliance. So hi Hannah, can you please introduce yourself and the work that you do?
Oh, kia ora, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, yes, so I coordinate the New Zealand Product Stewardship Council. So we are a charitable trust. We're an independent voice for effective product stewardship. And we analyze, our organization is made up of experts in zero waste, but also across product stewardship generally. We have academics in our organization, as well as practitioners and representatives from local authorities. And so we do a lot of advocacy around what effective product stewardship is. So making producers responsible for the products that they have and ultimately their waste, which should lead to product redesign. So we also do a lot of work with the government in New Zealand in terms of submissions on policy and commenting on policy and that kind of thing, and try and simplify issues for the general public so that people can engage on matters related to waste that most people really do care about, and specifically around plastic as well as a major topic focus for us. And I'm also a senior associate at the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies at Victoria University of Wellington, where I do research into the areas of zero waste and the circular economy. And I'm really interested in zero waste organizing, practical zero waste lifestyle solutions, and reusable packaging systems within that product stewardship space, which is a really important way of reducing plastic use and therefore plastic pollution.
Great, thank you, Hannah. Glad to have you with us. Also want to invite Daughter Ray from the Zero Waste Network Aotearoa to join us. And hi, Daughter, please introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Zero Waste Network Aotearoa.
Kia ora, thanks Liam, and thank you to the Gaia team for organising the session and inviting the Zero Waste Network to be part of it. The Zero Waste Network Aotearoa represents community organisations who are working towards zero waste in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Our mission is to connect, educate, enable and inspire our members to be a unifying voice, really in creating a regenerative circular economy. So the network has over 100 members. In 2019, just to give you a sense of the impact, that we had, those groups recovered an estimated 30,000 tonnes of resources. We also employed over 700 people and had a turnover of around $30 million. So there's a range of members. They do all sorts of different things in this space, and then they've got the Zero Waste Network, and I'm part of that. My job title is the executive officer, and it's very much an administrative role, making sure that we've got the right people in the right places to deliver the strategies that our board of trustees develops. And our team is quite a small one. We've got, I think, 7 staff, but we've also got a a pretty comprehensive team of awesome people who we contract to do different projects and our comms and things like that. So we've got a team of almost 30 people around the country. And yeah, just to say, I'm definitely not an expert on plastics, but I do have a sense of what the network does in the zero waste space, and that is on plastic sometimes.
Awesome. Thank you, Daughter. Thanks so much for both of your introductions. Thanks for all the work you do as well. So we're going to jump into questions soon, but before we do, I just wanted to give a bit more of a background about the waste and plastic pollution situation in the Pacific region. So according to World Bank data, the East Asia and Pacific region generated 468 million tonnes of waste in 2016, and that's an average rate of just over 0.5 kilogram per person per day. The largest waste generators are actually high-income countries or states, and in fact, New Zealand is one of the highest producers of waste per capita in the region at about 2 kilograms per person per day. Australia, so that's 4 times the average. Australia produces over 1.5 kilograms per person per day, 3 times the average. While in contrast, many Pacific Island states produce less than 1 kilogram per person per day, and a number of them are below the average of 0.5 kilograms per person per day. Now, plastics make up only about 12% of the region's waste, but I'm sure that you all know these figures are based on weight, which is a bit misleading when it comes to plastics, which are typically very lightweight. And as we know, plastics are very prone to being mismanaged or littered and very easily escape into the environment. In fact, the East Asia and Pacific region accounts for 60% of mismanaged plastics globally. And Pacific Island states are particularly negatively affected by marine plastic pollution. And much of that comes from other countries or fishing activities in the region. So many of these Pacific Island countries have been very vocal and influential in calling for international cooperation on plastic pollution. Pacific countries are also very heavily reliant on imports of plastics, both for manufacturing new plastic and also for pre-made products. So, for example, in 2017, New Zealand imported over 300,000 tons of plastic resin to be used to manufacture products. And like most of the world, packaging is the largest fraction of this, making up 60% of all of New Zealand's plastic production. But plastics were also a key component in New Zealand's imports of other kinds of products, for example, textiles, footwear, and fishing gear. New Zealand and Australia have also been very reliant on exporting our plastic waste. So in 2017 as well, New Zealand exported 41.5 thousand tonnes of plastic waste, and Australia in the same year exported 125,000 tonnes, or 36% of all of the plastics that they collected. Now, China's national sword policy in 2018 did create a huge problem for New Zealand and Australia for our recycling systems, because both countries, really heavily relied on exporting plastic waste, as I just mentioned, and that led to a huge amount of our plastics being stockpiled or landfilled, both in New Zealand and Australia. So that did lead both countries to regulate waste trading to some extent, by requiring sorting of plastic types and requiring low contamination rates before they can be exported now. And both countries have talked about the need to recycle more of their own plastics within their own borders as well. Incineration is thankfully not a big player in the South Pacific, except for, unfortunately, a growing industry in Australia, where at least 2 large waste-to-energy incinerators are under construction, and many more incinerators of various types are already in operation. But in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in small Pacific Island states, there currently are no municipal waste incineration facilities, and we really hope to keep it that way. Many Pacific Island states also have world-leading plastic product bans and levies in place. So countries like the Marshall Islands, Vanuatu, Niue, Samoa, Papua New Guinea, and also the Australian and New Zealand governments recently announced actions or proposals to phase out some problematic plastics, to ban them. to increase onshore recycling, to develop new product stewardship schemes and more. And in New Zealand, we expect further announcements on this later this year. New Zealand has also already banned single-use plastic bags in 2019. Now, despite these positive movements in the right direction, these policies really only focus on a small number of issues, and they ignore a whole range of other waste and pollution problems. So we are still a long way off from taking real steps towards a zero waste and circular economy, but that's what our guests today are working really hard to make happen. So let's dive a bit deeper into this topic and start with a few questions for Hannah. So Hannah, why do you think the Pacific region needs government policy and regulation to handle plastic waste?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Liam. Before I answer anything, I really want to acknowledge a really incredible piece of work that was completed for the Environmental Investigation Agency by my colleague at the Product Stewardship Council, Dr. Tricia Farrelly, as well as Dr. Steph Burrell, who's part of the Aotearoa Plastic Pollution Alliance, and Sasha Fuller, who's based in the UK. They did a really thorough overview and gap analysis of plastic pollution prevention policies and legislation throughout Pacific Island countries. And so if anyone wants to read it, I think Liam's going to share a link to it in the chat box, and you can refer to it at a later date, but it's a really great piece of work. So in the Pacific region, we definitely need better policies for handling plastic waste, but also for just reducing plastic waste generation in the first place. And part of that means looking beyond just thinking about plastic waste towards focusing on preventing plastic pollution. And this is because plastic pollutes at all stages of its life cycle, not just at the end of life when it becomes waste. So we need to be focusing on policies that reduce this pollution at every step of the process, which includes starting at the very top of the chain with measures to reduce overall plastic production and consumption in the first place. But why do we need policies like this in the Pacific region? In short, it's because plastic pollution is already having a catastrophic and devastating impact on our region. And this is for a number of reasons. The Pacific region is really defined by and named after the ocean that surrounds us. We're mostly a collective of island nations, so the plastic we use across the region is at extreme risk of entering into the marine environment. So I live in Wellington in New Zealand, which is on the coast, and it's also very windy, and all parts of our waste management system leak plastic into the ocean, whether it's the rubbish bins overflowing, the fact that our municipal collection of rubbish and recycling happens on the side of the road, so stuff can blow out. Even our landfill constantly has plastic blowing out of it, and our landfill is situated reasonably close to a marine reserve, as well as lots of streams that feed into that marine reserve. Across our region, generally, many small island nations in the Pacific just don't have space for landfills to dispose of plastic waste. And there is also not comprehensive waste collection systems for these highly geographically dispersed populations over heaps of islands. So this altogether increases the risk of plastic being put in landfills, which have high potential for leakage, or just plastic getting burnt or dumped into the sea. And even in countries like New Zealand, where we have controlled landfills and comparatively accessible and comprehensive collection services, burning and burying of plastic waste on private land is still surprisingly common. So whenever plastic is buried or burnt in uncontrolled locations, it causes toxic contamination of land, waterways, sea, and air, and triggers a range of ecological and human health consequences that have no borders. So when plastic gets into marine environments, we all know it has a devastating impact. To just give one example, in New Zealand, we have the highest proportion of seabirds in the world that are endangered or at risk of extinction, and plastic pollution is a major contributor to that. So we actually have a goal in New Zealand of being predator-free by 2050, but unfortunately for our seabirds, the government's definition of predator doesn't include plastic. So plastic in the marine environment also impacts human health because it can enter the food chain through food sourced from the sea. And this starts to have really significant cultural impacts in our region too, because Indigenous and local populations across the Pacific have always relied on the moana or the sea for food. So ultimately, plastic pollution impacts all of us wherever we are on the planet, but there is a really important environmental justice dimension in our region, because while Pacific Island countries contribute less than 1.3% of the world's mismanaged plastics in the ocean, these countries are one of the main recipients of plastic pollution and its impacts. So we really do need to look really hardly and really closely at this issue. The other and final major reason that we need better policies to reduce plastic usage in the Pacific and globally relates to the fact that plastic is made of oil. Inevitably, then, the whole plastic production process from extraction through to manufacture, transport, use, and disposal contributes to climate change. If we carry on the way we're going globally, then emissions from plastic may account for up to 15% of global emissions by 2050. The Pacific region is already facing existential climate change impacts, with many island states already profoundly affected by sea level rise. So reducing plastic usage is important. It's an important part of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions now and into the future for our region.
Thank you, Hannah, for that comprehensive answer to the question. And I'm interested to hear your perspectives on, in order to deal with a lot of those issues you're talking about, what kinds of policies can help us to build a circular economy, and perhaps also what are some of the kinds of policies that are working towards that are happening in the Pacific region at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like sometimes people ask, like, how does plastic fit into the efforts to pursue a circular economy generally? And I think we need to understand that the circular economy is about changing our relationship with the way that we use the Earth's resources. And as I mentioned before, plastic comes from oil, so addressing the way we use it is like a natural part of the circular economy. So ultimately, in a circular economy, there is no waste and we are resource efficient. And in a system like that, materials or products cycle around the system in closed loops endlessly. So right now, the way that we use plastic looks nothing like this. It's completely linear. That's why we see so much plastic used in single-use contexts, why our economy is reliant on virgin plastic, why so much plastic ends up in landfills being burnt or polluting our natural environment. So fixing all of that is intrinsically connected to the circular economy, and that then guides us to the kinds of policies that we need to put in place, and some of those are related to what's happening in our region already. So yep, single use is not at all circular. And so one really common policy that we see to address that is just market restrictions, bans, levies, or import restrictions on single-use plastics. And I actually really want to acknowledge Pacific Island nations for being global leaders in these types of laws, implementing them much earlier than many other countries internationally, and actually going far wider in the range of products that they ban. So for example, Tuvalu has one of the broadest bans in the world. They include bans on plastic water bottles and pouches, ice packs, alongside all the usual single-use plastics. And other countries with these types of laws and bans and levies include Samoa, Vanuatu, Fiji, Kiribati, and Palau. New Zealand and various Australian states are also joining the single-use plastic ban party. So most Australian states and New Zealand have, well, New Zealand's banned plastic bags, and some Australian states have too. New Zealand's currently considering a proposal to ban a range of plastic products, including single-use plastic cotton buds, hard to recycle PVC and polystyrene for food packaging, plastic cutlery, produce bags, non-compostable fruit stickers, and all that kind of thing. In New Zealand and Australia, we're also seeing more attempts to use product stewardship policies to target plastics. So again, making businesses responsible for their waste. So Australia has a scheme already in place with industry to put product stewardship for plastic packaging. New Zealand has declared plastic packaging a priority product, which means that now a product stewardship scheme may be developed. And one other policy that's really linked to both reducing plastic pollution and the circular economy that we're seeing across the region, particularly in Australia, are container deposit schemes for beverages. So when you have a small deposit on a beverage container, that customers can then get that deposit back when they return the empty container. So by doing that, you lift recycling rates, and you also open the potential for reusable, refillable beverages, which is a key way of reducing waste and the ultimate circular system. So there are many states in Australia that have beverage container return or deposit schemes in place already. Some of them have been going since the 70s. There's a really successful one in Pacific as well, in Palau on the island of Koror, which has a 90% recovery rate. And New Zealand is currently considering implementing a container return scheme as well. It's being considered by the minister. So that's just a handful of policies that can be used to drive a circular economy for plastic, particularly for packaging.
That's great, yeah, and really cool to hear the wide range of things that are happening. But I'm also interested in your thoughts on whether these policies are enough, or whether we need to do a lot more to address plastic pollution as a whole.
Yeah, you probably won't be surprised to know that no, not enough. The plastic crisis is rather huge, and a lot of what is being done is very small and around the edges. So there are a number of reasons why what we're doing is not enough, and which would point to what else we could do. One really big issue is that there's still not enough focus on activity at the top of the waste hierarchy. So a lot of plastic policy strategies are focused around recycling or sort of traditional siloed waste management strategies that just don't work for the 21st century, and also don't make sense, particularly in small island nations where there's actually no viable means of managing waste better. So we really need to be looking more at innovative reduction and reuse approaches. The other problem with a lot of our policies is they continue to focus on the harm plastic causes at the end of its life when it becomes waste, but plastic is harmful for other reasons. Plastic is dangerous for ecological and human health because of the range of toxic chemicals that are put into plastic to help it perform different functions. And these additives need to be better researched and regulated and ultimately phased out. Because if we want to create a circular economy for plastics, it needs to be a safe circular economy, not cycling around toxic additives that can compound and harm us further. We also need to realize that plastic products release microplastics during their use, not just at the end of life. So like tires and textiles are releasing microplastics throughout their functional life. We really need more research and regulation on how to reduce and eliminate plastic pollution from these sources. There's a bit of work going into the impacts and mitigation of microplastic in the New Zealand context by a Crown Research Institute called ESR. So I'm hopeful that this will lead to more policy in this area. We also are not doing a very good job of targeting the ongoing use of virgin plastic, because every time we use brand new plastic, it means we have to extract more oil, which increases climate change. So we really need to be setting national and regional plastic reduction targets, not only to reduce plastic waste, but also to reduce emissions. The other area that could be improved is that, yep, bans on single-use plastic and levies are good, but bans and levies are a really blunt tool, and we need more nuanced regulation to go alongside this. So we need to be investing in reusable or zero packaging alternatives to these single-use products. Otherwise, we're just going to result in just swapping single-use plastic for single-use something else, or single-use bioplastics, which are a whole other issue as well. So we should be combining bans with eco-levies on other single-use products that can then be used to fund reuse and refill infrastructure. And we need to be building reuse into container deposit systems and applying those systems to a wider range of packaging, not just beverage containers. And with product stewardship, again, focusing higher up on the waste hierarchy, but we also need to be giving greater control to design product stewardship schemes to the wider community and public. In New Zealand and Australia, what we're seeing is that these plastic packaging product stewardship schemes and other product stewardship schemes are largely being designed by industry, and industry don't really have a great deal of incentive to drive really ambitious reduction targets for their own product. And in the Pacific Island context, product stewardship policies really need to include an extra R in the waste hierarchy, which is the R that stands for repatriation. So basically, schemes need to be tailored so that there aren't only import controls on what is brought to these countries, but when producers import these products into Pacific Island countries, they need to commit to actually take them back at the end of their life and bring them back to a country like Australia or New Zealand where they can be managed appropriately. And doing that may actually be so expensive that it incentivizes these companies to adopt reuse or zero packaging models. And just a couple more things really is that We need to do much better at joining up efforts regionally and globally, because no one country in the Pacific can actually address this situation alone. And we need to recognize that there is an imbalance in resources and influences between different countries in our region, and that appropriate levels of support need to go to smaller island nations to develop their national plastic policies and to set up alternative models and to be able to influence regional international discussions and negotiations. And that really leads into the last point I have, is that the Pacific region is just full of so many different Indigenous worldviews, practices, and ways of being and doing that, like all human knowledge systems, go back centuries and millennia. And there's a real need to better explore traditional and local knowledge, values, and alternatives to plastic and to food systems across Pacific Island countries, and also within Australia and New Zealand as settler colonial states. In our countries, we've actively suppressed such knowledge systems and imposed a way of being that has actually created the plastic pollution crisis. So enabling Indigenous solutions to come forward, that requires proper financing and resourcing and greater representation in national, regional, and international policy and science. And I note that in New Zealand, there are small steps towards more bicultural research and policy analysis in the area of plastic pollution and the circular economy. So, for example, Māori researchers have been involved in the study of microplastic pollution through ESR. Amazing researchers like Tina Ngata, Māori twin-hulled Waka or Wakahaurua have conducted plastic pollution research in the South Pacific and across New Zealand's coastlines. And Waikato University has a circular economy research institute now that is attempting to ground itself in kaupapa Māori and Mātauranga Māori. So hopeful that initiatives like this can be expanded upon more, because there's a massive opportunity to develop policies and understanding in our region that will have an impact beyond our region, and but a really meaningful impact here too.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah. That's very, very comprehensive answers to those questions, and given, I'm sure, a lot of us a lot to think about, a lot of ideas for policy solutions, and a wide range of solutions and ways of knowing to draw on. And I also just want to remind people of the report that was shared earlier from written by Tricia Farrelly, Steph Burrell, and Sasha Fuller, which is really quite a comprehensive analysis of Pacific plastic policies, and a lot of great recommendations in there too for how we can solve some of these issues. We've had a couple of questions come through from attendees. We will get to these soon, but I wanted to ask a few questions of Daughter Ray from Zero Waste Network before we get to those. So Daughter, can you tell us what you see as the role of the community sector organizations like Zero Waste Network to develop policies on plastic and waste pollution, and how does the network involve, the wider public and your members in this kind of policy advocacy?
Yeah, cool. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, so I think it's important to make the distinction between the work that the Zero Waste Network does, who I work for, and also the work that our members are doing. So as I said before, we're actually quite a small organisation, and I totally acknowledge that I think it's got an important role in the space of developing policy. But in response to your question, I'd really like to focus on the work of our members. So within the network, there's just a huge variety of activities that are being undertaken at different sites within different organisations, and it's very much kind of on the ground and interfacing with the general public. So I think a good example of this are the community resource recovery centres that we have around the country. These are places that are run by community groups that are receiving and processing waste materials from their communities, and then they're finding markets for them, or they're sending them to landfill, or they're stockpiling them if they can't recycle them. So it's a super practical kind of hands-on interaction with plastics, with lots of forms of waste. And it makes them a super important source of information about plastic and about plastic pollution. We know from them down to the level of which products and which brands are problematic. And I just can't stress how valuable I think that role is. And then I think that there's a really important educational role that our members play. So they're out there, they're doing a whole range of activities. And while they're doing that, they're having conversations with their customers and their stakeholders. And often those conversations are about issues. And, you know, within New Zealand, it's super, you know, good to know that actually plastic pollution is an issue that lots of people care about. So it is those kinds of conversations that our members are having. So they're talking about, you know, what strategies there are for reducing it, and really encouraging people and building kind of consensus that it is something that people want to deal with. And then when policies are developed, there's also a really important role that these people who are spread around the country are able to allow that policy to be integrated into the community.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's, yeah, and thanks for clarifying the sort of the difference between the work your members do and the work that you do as an organization. And I can see how, you know, the members who are just working on the ground and at the coalface are, you know, really well informed about the issues. And I'm interested to know how Zero Waste Network as an organization that you work for sort of engages and uses that on the ground grassroots knowledge and the involvement of the public and your and the general public as well in developing your own sort of policy responses to some of those issues.
Yeah, cool. And I noticed there was a question about banning single-use plastics in New Zealand. So yeah, I definitely want to touch on that. And I think the biggest strategy we have is really making the use of our network. So I'd say that's our main strategy. So as I said before, we've got 100 members or over 100 members all around the country. And each of those comes with its own connections and its own knowledge. And I think the role of the Zero Waste Network is really about ensuring that public involvement in policy is a two-way thing. So first of all, we have a role in feeding information into those places, into those communities, and telling them about the opportunities to get involved with policy and to explain, I think Hannah mentioned this earlier, to explain and simplify what current policy looks like and what new policy might mean. So, and then the second part is making sure that there's information coming back the other way. So gathering the ideas and making sense of what the community's priorities are. So I think over the last few years, our wider network has gotten much better at working together on these issues. And so I wanted to focus on an example of creating joint submissions, and specifically a joint submission to our government's proposals last year on how to reduce the impact of plastic in the environment by moving away from hard to recycle and single-use items. So I want to explain how the kind of joint submission process looks, and I guess some kind of important context is that every now and then the New Zealand government either has to or it chooses to ask the public for feedback on ideas for changes in legislation or processes. And the response to that request from the government, we call those submissions. So that might happen everywhere, and people might be super familiar with this process, but I didn't want to assume that, you know, New Zealand is actually, Aotearoa is actually quite a small country. And so the opportunity to get involved with policy making is often kind of directly with central government, where in other places it might look totally different. It might be with a state government or a regional entity or like a very local council or something. But for us, the joint submission process What we've done is that when our government consults the public about waste issues, we've worked collectively to develop a comprehensive response. So the first thing we do is we have a meeting. And you know, the meetings that we've called, they've been online using Zoom, and they've been an open invitation. So we've identified people who we think are going to be interested in responding. And in this case, it's often Hannah and Liam. And lots of the groups that we get in touch with are from our members, but also acknowledging they're not always within the membership. They might be allies like Greenpeace. I think a key thing is that, yeah, it's an open invitation. If somebody knows of another key individual, they get included into the conversation. So we have that meeting and we brainstorm kind of the general idea of what we think the submission needs to be, and we kind of divide up the work. And I'm hoping I can share my screen and show you guys the final result by going to here and showing you this one. Yes, okay. So this is our joint submission on these hard to recycle and single-use items. And there's just a few things I want to point out here. First of all, it's 23 pages, so it's quite a long document, but we had all of these people sign up to it. So that's actually 40 organisations. You can see some of their logos here. And I guess the other thing I want to point out about it is these are comprehensive, kind of well-researched answers, very much, and thanks to people like Hannah and Liam, who spend a lot of time doing this, often volunteer time. So we've got these comprehensive answers, we've got data, and we've got references attached to them, and it gets sent to the government. I'll just stop sharing. We can probably make that available if anybody is interested. But yeah, once we have that kind of draft document forming, we do a few other things as well. And so for the Zero Waste Network, so all of these organisations that drafted the document wanted to do slightly different things to engage with their communities. For us, we made it available for other people to comment on, and we incorporated those answers into the final version that was sent to the government. But we also sent it to our comms team, who whittled it down to some very, very simple answers, and we developed a guide that could be sent out to organisations within our membership so that those communities could use it to make their own submissions. And so the answers were much, much more succinct. And then we also made use of our awesome graphic designer, Izzy, and we got our comms team once again to get super succinct. And I want to show you what the result was. So back to this one, but then go to here. You can see our poster. So what we've got here is a very, very clear call to action. Take action on plastic waste. We've got a real quick summary of what the government's proposing. We've got this iconic New Zealand bird, the piwakawaka, made out of the items that the submission refers to. And we've got a QR code. So that QR code took people to a pre-filled form, and people could just put in their name and send their submission to the government. So we've done heaps of the hard work for people. And 426 people made submissions that way, but thousands of people used the QR code to check out what we were doing. So yeah, I think that, I'll just stop sharing. I think that was a really long answer to your question, but hopefully with some kind of, kind of very practical suggestions. And I guess the short answer could be, we answered some questions and we made a poster.
That's great. Nice one, daughter. Yeah, and I think thanks to the work that Zero Waste Network did in kind of getting that that whole proposal out to the public, the government received quite a large number of submissions for that one. And I know we're still waiting to hear back from the government about what they've decided to do. So yeah, still waiting. But I'm interested to know if the Zero Waste Network has had any sort of examples of success using this kind of method of policy advocacy, and you know, has this way of engaging the public and engaging members helped in that?
Yeah, so I definitely know that the numbers are going up in terms of submission responses, and there were some good stats which I wasn't able to find comparing submissions to MFE waste issues, you know, many years ago compared to what they are now, and they are kind of significantly more. They're in the thousands versus kind of maybe 100. So we know that those numbers are gathering momentum, but I think that there are probably some other things that I think are good signs. So I don't necessarily think it's appropriate to claim credit for the engagement. I think there's lots of reasons why there's more engagement now, but I do think that we've played a part, and I think we've got, you know, some really clever people who are working really hard to make that happen. And I think the fact that a lot of those people are being contacted to be on things like design committees for product stewardship schemes, and are getting in front of the government is probably another sign that there are, you know, that what we're saying is useful and it's being recognised as such. Yeah,
that's great. That's awesome. And just finally, do you have any recommendations for other networks or organizations who are in a similar line of work, apart from all the brilliant stuff you've already mentioned?
Yeah, that was actually quite a hard one. I mean, I think I might just kind of reiterate what I've said, and that actually you're just kind of making use of what you've got, the technology that exists that people know how to use is actually, you know, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can actually use really simple tools. We use Zoom, Google Docs, and a form plugin on our WordPress website. So it really doesn't have to be a kind of complicated whiz-bang process to get the message out there. But one thing I have learned from our awesome comms team is that actually sometimes the skill is in getting the amount of detail right for the audience that you're focused on. So all of that you know, really comprehensive answers that we put, they're 23 pages, like that stuff is going to be useful for the Ministry for the Environment officials, but it is not going to be something that people who are dropping their milk bottles off at the recycling centre are going to engage with. So you have to kind of learn how to get that right.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, daughter, for all of that, sharing all of that really awesome experience. And there has been interest in getting access to some of those documents you shared. So that'd be cool to share those after the webinar. I just wanted to quickly cover a couple of questions to both of you, daughter and Hannah, around, you know, some of the challenges of doing the work that you do. And I know that there's been some good successes that we've heard, and things are moving in the right direction, but there are some pretty significant challenges. And what are, I mean, maybe start with Hannah. What are some of the challenges that you've encountered, you know, when doing this kind of advocacy work?
Yeah, I think one of the really tricky things is kind of like a philosophical or ideological issue within government generally. I think that there's this focus on trying to make the current linear economy less unsustainable rather than transitioning to a new and truly sustainable approach. And I think often when you're lobbying, you're sort of up against government inertia, or government is very slow sometimes, and you can see the extent of the problem is so huge and the pace at which government and industry moves is so slow. And so that can be quite tricky, because Everybody wants to treat the waste hierarchy like a ladder, but really we should be treating it like a funnel. So we start at the top and try and turn off the tap rather than like mopping up constantly. And that's a really big shift, I think, for government to do. And so that can be quite tiring when you're lobbying constantly for just really small things. And I think the other really big challenge is that there is constantly ongoing lobbying from vested interests, particularly in the plastics and packaging space, who have a lot of money. And this is really well outlined, and there's an amazing report called Talking Trash that came out last year by the Changing Market Foundation that really details very thoroughly the distract, delay and derail tactics that the packaging and plastics industry use to stop progressive regulation. And they included case studies from all around the world, and there wasn't a case study from the South Pacific, but honestly, like every one that I read was like, oh yeah, we see this kind of stuff happening here too. So that's really difficult as well, because not only is that lobbying going against what you're trying to do, but there's an imbalance there in terms of resources, that organizations often doing things for free or on very, very slim budgets. So that's a challenge.
Yeah, and I think that gets to, you know, this issue that, you know, so many of us are trying to get big changes in plastic policy to create zero waste and circular economies, but there are real limitations, you know, as you know, people working in the community sector, and maybe there are particular limitations in our regions and in our respective countries as well. But Daughter, did you have any thoughts on limitations and challenges to this kind of work?
I totally agree with Hannah on the kind of yeah, being up against people and interests that have got more resource than we often do. And I think it's really about being, you know, the response to that needs to be about being super clever about how you work, and that's really difficult lots of the time. And on a really very practical level, I also want to just mention that often timing is really difficult. It's super challenging. It feels like often, I don't know if this is true in other places, but the New Zealand government seems to put like super short, you know, you've got a month to respond to 23 questions on really significant issues. So you need to be really, really clever about how you get people working and you know, divide things up and divide and conquer and get everybody involved. Like doing meaningful engagement with those timeframes can be really tricky, and they also seem to really love making things due at Christmas time. I find that challenging.
Yep, classic Christmas time questions. Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Yeah, thanks again, you two, for your answers. Maybe I'll move to some questions that have come in from attendees, and just a reminder to all of you watching here, you're welcome to ask questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to answer them. So I'll start with this question. And this might be to Hannah or Daughter, whoever feels like answering. So waste trade has been the buzzword lately, following recent news of waste dumping in Turkey, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and other parts of Asia. How do we strike a balance in applying waste trade in the context of countries with limited disposal options, for example, Pacific countries?
I'm happy to go first. I think maybe in terms of Pacific Island countries, we'd very much be looking at that concept of repatriation that I mentioned earlier. And so it's not so much waste trade, but more to do with producer responsibility. So if producers are making a profit by selling products in countries that don't actually have the system or even the capacity or the space or land or resource or whatever to manage that appropriately at end of life, then that needs to be built into product stewardship schemes in the first place. And one thing that we need to be good at doing is starting to provide, I think, resourcing and support to enable Pacific Island countries to really bring that kind of policy into their product stewardship programs, because I don't think it's easy to do if you're leaving it up to industry to design schemes, which is actually what we do in New Zealand. So we should start to consider policies to sort of bring that balance back. So yeah, I think rather than thinking about it as waste trade, we need to think about it as producer responsibility. And ultimately, if producers aren't willing to take their products back from countries that don't have the capacity or the space to manage them, then actually that needs to be driving product redesign. And so that's when we need to start looking at reusable and refillable alternatives, or binding consumption and production reduction targets, because ultimately we shouldn't be producing things that there is no capacity to process or manage.
I agree, and mostly don't have very much more to add. I think it's very easy to just living in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it's kind of, I almost forget that we're a Pacific country, but we are. And, you know, we're super reliant on offshore markets. So, and, you know, Hannah's just talked about this, but we really don't have the infrastructure here to deal with what we're using. And so, you know, I think that's a huge challenge for Aotearoa and other Pacific countries, is how do we get that infrastructure? Yeah, and I wondered whether this might be an interesting thing to bring up, but we've been exploring this idea of kind of leverage points towards sustainability. Donella Meadows and others have explored this, and it's basically when you're trying to change a system, in this case the system is kind of how we use resources, there's going to be different types of kind of interventions that you can lever a thing towards where it needs to go. And we've developed a graphic to try and explain how we think this looks with zero waste. So I might just quickly share my screen again, which is here. So yeah, we kind of define this as having 4 kind of key leverage points, and really the most important one we see as being mindset. But so often we are focused still on the infrastructure points and the activities. So while it's this kind of tricky thing of really acknowledging that we don't have the infrastructure, and then also acknowledging that the shifts that are really going to make the biggest change are when people decide that we need to do things differently. So trying to do all of those things at once is really, really tricky, I think. Yeah, and I totally recognize that all of these parts are interlinked, and that they'll have kind of knock-on effects. But it is really, really difficult to be having the conversations about, you know, why compostable plastic is the way to go, when what we really, really need is kind of product stewardship schemes that stop plastic waste going to places that really can't deal with them, or at least have some way of getting them back to places that can. So maybe that's useful for people.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Dorothy. It's often the kind of issues that and approaches that are really difficult to get incorporated into a policy level, I think, you know, and on the waste trade issue, you know, where there have been these recent announcements in New Zealand and Australia about, you know, restricting the plastics that we send overseas, but there isn't really any discussion of how do we change our behavior and our mindsets in the countries where that waste is being produced in the first place. You know, it's not part of the conversation at all. So yeah, thanks for sharing. That's useful. We have another question here. Single-use plastic is already banned in New Zealand since 2019. So that's, we banned single-use plastic bags. Can you share how it happened? In Bangladesh, we are trying to ban single-use plastics by 2023, but it is really difficult to convince MNCs to convince them to change their packaging for sachets and mini packs and that sort of thing. So if you can share anything from New Zealand's experience of banning single-use plastics. I'll just quickly just sort of give a bit of context to that. So yeah, we've only banned single-use plastic shopping bags in New Zealand so far in 2019. So it was interestingly a lot of probably at least 10 years or more of really solid campaigning from a number of individuals and organizations in the community sector in New Zealand to get single-use plastic shopping bags banned. And you know, ultimately it took, I think, a couple of the major supermarket retailers to take steps that then I think perhaps pushed it over the line, eventually got the government to institute a ban. But you know, there was so much work and so much momentum going into just getting that one specific product banned, you know, the single-use plastic shopping bags, and there are just, you know, an ocean's worth of other types of single-use plastics, and so that's New Zealand is consulting on some of those other types of single-use plastics we might want to phase out as well. But it's been a very long, slow process here as well. But I wonder if Hannah or Daughter have anything you want to add in the New Zealand experience of banning single-use plastics so far.
I think your summary was pretty good, Liam, I think, putting it in context. But I think there are some learnings from that experience. And I think one major learning is that, well, firstly, they included bioplastic within that ban. So that's really important to do. So it's not just petroleum-based plastic, but cornstarch bags and so on were all included. But the other important thing is just that rather than just having a blunt ban, we need to bring bans in alongside other policy tools that just avoid swapping from one single-use item to another or exploiting the loopholes. So in New Zealand, the single-use plastic ban was only for bags with handles that were plastic and 70 microns or thickness or smaller. And so what's happened is lots of people just cut the handles off the bags, so they no longer had handles, and gave them out. Lots of people started getting plastic bags that were 71 microns or thicker and gave them out. Otherwise, lots of brown paper bags instead. Or we now see these really thin woven plastic bags that people are basically using as a single-use bag, and it's still plastic, but it's woven, so it doesn't count. So I think if we were to do it again, it would be really important to think about, well, are we going to put levies on any single-use product other than the one you're banning, to just disincentivize people just swapping? And any single-use plastic ban needs to be accompanied by incentives to encourage reuse.
I don't have anything to add.
Cool, thanks, Daughter, and thank you, Hannah. Yeah, really, really important points there, and yeah, that's definitely seeing those hardly better alternatives go in place for plastic bags. So yeah, a lot to learn from that experience, I think. Please keep your questions coming through, everyone. Just while I'll give everyone a moment to ask some more questions, I'll just throw another question at both Hannah and Daughter, because both of you did raise it at some point in your answers earlier. And that is that, do you feel that sometimes plastics policies can be too focused on the environmental harms of plastic pollution at the expense of other issues such as social justice and human rights?
I think Hannah did she gave a super good kind of rundown in her introduction of the interaction. So I think it's really, I think that kind of compartmentalizing things and putting things into silos is kind of part of the issue, and that it really is very important to take quite a big picture on these issues and understand that it's a super complex world that is going to, if your actions in one sphere is definitely going to have knock-on effects in multiple spheres. And so I think that it's really important to have very firm kind of environmental care, and that also alongside that will come often social justice and the creation of social value. I think there's kind of almost two ways you can, it's kind of the harm, but also the value that you can create by doing things well. So I tend to kind of focus on the kind of positive, and what can we create? But there's also this other question of what are we not doing? And I do think that the perspective of us in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is a very specific one. We do have kind of strong ties to the Pacific Islands, but I also think that for a lot of our experience is quite a developed world experience. Our landfills are very managed, and we don't have waste incinerators, and we do have plastic pollution, and we can see the effects of that, but it's certainly not as kind of visible or immediate as the kind of health and social justice effects of kind of plastic pollution and bad waste management are in other countries. And so I do think we're a little bit blinkered, and it is very easy to kind of become kind of environmental warriors and forget about the social justice aspect of it. So I think it's really important to keep it present. Hannah, I'm interested in what you're going to say.
Oh, no, I really agree with everything that you just said, daughter. And I mean, looking at it from another angle too, I think plastics, their true cost is not embedded in their purchase price or what they enable. And I think the narrative of the cheap and convenience thing around plastics is really difficult to go up against in the face of social and economic inequality, where cheap, convenient products are often seen as a stand-in for actual social equality. So often, comments will be made, oh, well, if you get rid of this product or you internalize the cost, then it's going to be too expensive for people. And I think that is true in our current system in many situations, but I think that we need to deal with the actual cause of that, which is social and economic inequality. Like, why is food and housing and so on so expensive, and why are so many people on such low wages that aren't livable, and so on. And that often the things that are causing that social and economic inequality are the same things that are driving the environmental crisis. And so being able to see how these things are connected and embedding social and environmental justice into zero waste and plastic pollution advocacy is really, really important. And so, we have to not be blinkered to it. We have to be conscious of it because it's the same struggle. But at certain times, even though it's the same struggle, there is a really important conversation around making the space and ensuring that this conversation is being had by multiple people throughout society, and not just with eco warriors, I guess, to make sure that all the dimensions come out.
Yeah, I really appreciate what both of you said there. And I also want to acknowledge the work of Gaia Asia Pacific, or Gaia globally, really, and kind of both raising up the issues of the environmental and social harms of pollution, and ensuring that when we address one, we're addressing both. And so I think this is why, kind of going to Daughter's response, that it's valuable for people like us living in a developed country like New Zealand to connect and learn from experiences of other countries with very different situations. So but yeah, big sort of shout out to Gaia for the work they did in the space too. Perhaps one more question to both of you. Do you think that sometimes there is too much emphasis on plastic pollution as an issue, and should we be spending more energy getting the balance better on other types of waste issues at the same time, or do you feel like plastics are really central? Daughter, can I send that to you?
Well, I think it's a very similar question to the previous one, and I do think that plastics is a critical issue, and I guess the consequences of it are so kind of all-encompassing. Like, it is a health issue, it's a social justice issue, it's an environmental issue for all of the species. So yeah, I think it has its place. I guess maybe my very kind of pragmatic answer is that no, I don't think there's too much emphasis, but that emphasis does not need to be carried by everyone in every organization. That waste is a significant issue that everybody can have a turn with, that there are going to be groups who are going to need to focus on other things, and that actually it can be useful not to always try and do everything, but to have a focus. And I think that finding other people who are working on complementary ways on other issues is really, really important. So we absolutely need people focused on plastics, and then we absolutely need people who are focused on food resilience and anti-incineration and all of the other multiple issues that there are.
Yeah, I agree with what Daughter said. And I think within the context of waste generally, I think it's really important to understand the specific issue of plastic pollution, but that doesn't mean that the solutions need to be only around plastic themselves. So I think it goes back to what I said before, that it may be that the solution to getting rid of single-use plastic sachets maybe to move to more reuse systems that use glass or use a different kind of more durable plastic product that can last for longer and be reused. So I think it's important to understand in all issues fully. Someone somewhere has to, but the solutions don't all have to come from that space.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. Thank you again. We don't have any other questions from attendees, so perhaps we'll start to wrap up. And but before we do close, I'd just like to invite Hannah and Daughter just to share with us some nuggets of learnings for the participants here. So just one or two sentences, maybe a quote or some wisdom that keeps you going and moving forward, despite all of the challenges that we face. And maybe it's some tips for members on plastic lobbying or advocacy, or maybe it's just some general inspiration. So can I start with you, Hannah?
Yes, sure. I think for me, one thing to understand, or that really helps me, is that the fight against plastic pollution is a really, really slow campaign and a very, very long game. And in one webinar that we were in with Tina Nata, who's an amazing advocate around Indigenous knowledge and also waste issues. She said something pretty much along the lines of the work to prevent and eliminate plastic pollution, it's not going to be achieved in one human lifetime. And so for those of us now, we can't expect to necessarily see or reap the benefits of the seeds that we're sowing now, but that doesn't mean that it's not worth it, or that those seedlings won't one day grow, thrive, or prosper. And I find this really helpful because if we just realize and become comfortable with the understanding that we may never see the positive outcomes of what we're working for now, that doesn't mean that we're not making progress. So yeah, I don't know if that's optimistic or not, but I think it helps me often, is just to remember it's a long game, and you've got to manage your expectations, but just because you can't see things doesn't mean that you're not making change. And I also just want to, say thank you so much to Gaia for creating this space for us today, and to the attendees, and thank you, Liam, for your excellent moderation.
Yeah. Thank you, Hannah. Daughter, can I ask you to share something that keeps you going, or anything else you'd like to share with our viewers today?
Yeah, I struggled with this one. I was like, oh, what does keep me going? But then I came up with 2 things, or maybe even 3. So first one is, when you find people like Hannah and Liam, you should look after them because they're amazing. So thank you guys for all of the work that you guys do with us. I really, really appreciate it. And yeah, I just, to my point earlier, is I really think that what keeps me going is that I have found people who have kind of complementary skills. So when I'm not good at something, there's somebody who is there that is behind me and able to do that thing. And then I had a nice whakatauki come past my desk the other day. So that's kind of like a proverb, and I'll end with it. So it's toi tū te marae a tānei mahuta, toi tū te marae a tangaroa, toi tū te tangata. So if the land is well and the sea is well, the people will thrive. So I think that really speaks to the kind of interdependence of all of these things. And it's not really it is what keeps me going. I kind of know that it's important, and I hold it and keep, trying every day.
That's lovely. Thank you, Daughter, for sharing that. Yeah, really, really lovely way to end. I think this really fascinating and informative discussion we've had. So thanks again, both to Hannah and Daughter, for sharing all of your wisdom and your expertise today. We hope that everyone watching is even more inspired to take action against plastic pollution and fight for policies in your countries and in your region. We hope that you will also share the recording of today's session. It will be posted on the Gaia website, on Facebook and on YouTube. So thanks again to everyone for joining us today. Don't forget to visit Gaia websites, no-burn.org and zerowasteworld.org, and check out our social media pages. So Gaia Asia Pacific on Facebook and Zero Waste Asia on Instagram and Twitter. And also check out the social media platforms for the Zero Waste Network, Aotearoa, the New Zealand Product Stewardship Council, the Rubbish Trip, and the Aotearoa Plastic Pollution Alliance. And remember, let's keep learning something new every day. It doesn't have to be big. We can always learn by nuggets. So this is Liam on behalf of APA and Gaia. See you all in our next webinar. Thank you.